part, we shall talk about strategies that we can use to improve the validity of measurements. Now, first, looking at sensitivity. We can improve sensitivity of a test in two ways. Either we do two-stage testing, but the two-stage testing should be simultaneous, and I'll come back to that. Or we can do two-stage testing, but the second test is a test with a higher sensitivity. Now, how do we increase specificity? We do two-stage testing, but the two-stage testing is sequential. Or the second test has a higher specificity. Now, I'll first explain the sequential testing. In sequential testing, what we do is that we first apply a test, and then all those who turn out positive, we apply another second screening opportunity. This has the effect of increasing specificity of the test. And I'll do a demonstration to illustrate this. So you imagine a population of 10,000 people, of whom the known prevalence of, let's say, a disease like diabetes is, let's say, 5%. Who determines this? The gold standard. So the gold standard says that, so they screen all these 10,000 people, and the gold standard, using the gold standard test. And the gold standard test shows that 5% have diabetes. So 5% of 10,000 is 500. So 500 people actually have the disease. So if this is a 2x2 table, we have the people with the disease. This is the gold standard. People with the disease and those without the disease. So we put the total here of 500. That means that 10,000 minus 500, 9,500 do not have the disease. Now you imagine that we apply a test with a sensitivity of 70% and specificity of 80%. So we deal, sensitivity deals with those who actually have the disease. So we apply this test which has sensitivity of 70%. So let's look at only the people with the disease, and we find that this test is able to identify 70%. So 70% of 500, if you do a quick calculation, is 350. So the true positives are 350 if we use this test with a 70% sensitivity. That means the false negatives are 150. Now, on the other hand, if the test has a specificity of 80%, it means that of this 9,500, it is able to detect 80% of them as negative. So 80% of 9,500 turns out to be 7,600. So that means that the balance, that is 1,900, are detected as false positives. They are false positives. So this is the first test. Now, in sequential testing, we get the entire top row. The people whom your public health screening test says are positive, all these, including the 350 true positives and the 1,900 false positives, these are the only ones we subject to the second screening test. We don't subject the negatives, we subject the positives to the second screening test. So we take these 350 and the 190 and we put them in another 2x2 table. So I said the 350 and the 1,900, the 350 actually have the disease. They actually have the disease. And the 1,900 were false positives. They don't have the disease. Now, in this 2x2 table, they are forming the total for the 2x2 table. Now, you imagine we apply a second test with a sensitivity of 90%. So of these 350, it will detect 90%. So 90% of 350 is 315. Is 315. So of the 350 people who were actually diagnosed to have the disease, the test, when you apply a second test, it misclassifies 35 of them as not having the disease. So the number reduces from 350 to 300 and what? And 15. So there is a loss. When you do sequential testing, there is a loss in sensitivity. On the other hand, out of the 1,900 who were negative, if you apply the second test, which has a specificity of 90%, 90% of 1,900 is 1790, will now be classified correctly as negative. They are now negative. So the false positives will remain only 100 and what? And 90. So we are left with only 190 false positives. Yet initially we had 1,900 false positives. These ones fall to just 190 false positives. So in essence, the specificity of this test increases, but there is a loss in sensitivity because the initial 350 people are now reduced to 315. Those who were true positives are now reduced to 315. So you lose some sensitivity, but you have some very good gains in specificity. So the net sensitivity falls to 63%, while the net specificity increases to 98%. So sequential testing increases net specificity but reduces net sensitivity. Now, in simultaneous testing, on the other hand, what do we do in simultaneous testing? In simultaneous testing, when I get your sample, say a blood sample, I divide it into several aliquots. Let's say 6 samples. And I test each of them, each of these 6 or 7, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6 samples. Now, for someone to be negative, they have to be negative for all these samples. It is only when they are negative for all the samples that I declare them negative. So what will result, if you look at our 2 by 2 table, you have the gold standard, disease, no disease, and then the test positive, negative. Here you have false negatives, true positives, and then false positives and true negatives. If for someone to be negative, they have to be negative with all these, the false negatives will go down. The false negatives will go down. So there is a reduction in sensitivity. But, sorry, there is an increase in sensitivity because the false negatives will go down. However, if someone fails any one of these, they are classified as positive, yet they might be negative. But just because you've done many, many tests, you're likely to make more mistakes. So the false positives may go high. So you lose specificity. So you lose some specificity. So that is what happens in sequential testing. Now, how do we decide? Both, which is important, sensitivity or specificity for a particular situation. Both sensitivity and specificity are desirable, but it is not always possible with the tests that we have. It's not always possible to achieve maximum sensitivity and maximum specificity. And it depends on the use to which the test is applied and what is at stake. If I get false positives, what is going to happen? If I get false negatives, what will happen? So can I trade off some sensitivity or specificity? So for example, for the blood bank, we need 100% sensitivity. There should be no false negatives. You should not get a false negative because if blood is positive for HIV or hepatitis and yet it reads negative, we are likely to give it to people and infect them. Then for voluntary counseling and testing, VCT, we need high specificity. So that when we tell someone that they are positive, they are really, we don't want false positives. We want the positives to be very few. We want to shift this upwards. So we need a high level of specificity. For STIs, we want to get as many people with STIs as possible. we may trade off and over-treat you even when you don't have an STI, because we want those who have the STIs not to spread. So we may trade off, so we need a very good sensitivity. However, tests with low validity, that is both sensitivity and specificity, should be discarded.